We're also learning tonight that President Trump spoke to Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu before the strikes, and the U.S. did give a heads up to Israel before the attacks. We also know President Trump meeting earlier today with his national security team at the White House immediately before announcing the U.S. strikes. He has long promised not to allow Iran to develop a nuclear weapon. All of this, of course, comes after more than a week of strikes on Iran by Israeli forces. Iran firing back, striking Tel Aviv and other locations inside Israel. And Iran had pledged to retaliate if the U.S. joined the attacks. The U.S. has been surging forces to the region with an additional aircraft carrier strike group arriving in the region this weekend. Of course, the breaking news tonight, the U.S. striking Iran, several nuclear sites inside Iran. The president calling it a tremendous success on the phone with our John Carl a short time ago. And as we look at the microphone there, we wait for the president to address the nation. Our chief White House correspondent, Mary Bruce, outside the White House tonight. And Mary, the president said he would give Iran 2 weeks. It turned out to be 2 days.
Yeah, David, quite a remarkable turn of events here in just 48 hours. The White House had told us just on Thursday that the president thought that he would have 2 weeks to make this decision. Here comes the president.
Again, meeting with his national security team earlier today at the White House. Let's listen to the president.
Thank you very much. A short time ago, the U.S. military carried out massive precision strikes on the 3 key nuclear facilities in the Iranian regime: Fordow, Natanz, and Esfahan. Everybody heard those names for years as they built this horribly destructive enterprise. Our objective was the destruction of Iran's nuclear enrichment capacity and a stop to the nuclear threat posed by the world's #1 state sponsor of terror. Tonight, I can report to the world that the strikes were a spectacular military success. Iran's key nuclear enrichment facilities have been completely and totally obliterated. Iran, the bully of the Middle East, must now make peace. If they do not, future attacks will be far greater and a lot easier. For 40 years, Iran has been saying death to America, death to Israel. They have been killing our people, blowing off their arms, blowing off their legs with roadside bombs. That was their specialty. We lost over 1,000 people, and hundreds of thousands throughout the Middle East and around the world have died as a direct result of their hate. In particular, so many were killed by their general, Qasem Soleimani. I decided a long time ago that I would not let this happen. It will not continue. I want to thank and congratulate Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu. We worked as a team like perhaps no team has ever worked before. And we've gone a long way to erasing this horrible threat to Israel. I want to thank the Israeli military for the wonderful job they've done. And most importantly, I want to congratulate the great American patriots who flew those magnificent machines tonight, and all of the United States military on an operation the likes of which the world has not seen in many, many decades. Hopefully, we will no longer need their services in this capacity. I hope that's so. I also want to congratulate the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Dan Raisin Kane, spectacular general, and all of the brilliant military minds involved in this attack. With all of that being said, this cannot continue. There will be either peace or there will be tragedy for Iran far greater than we have witnessed over the last 8 days. Remember, there are many targets left. Tonight's was the most difficult of them all, by far, and perhaps the most lethal. But if peace does not come quickly, we will go after those other targets with precision, speed, and skill. Most of them can be taken out in a matter of minutes. There's no military in the world that could have done what we did tonight, not even close. There has never been a military that could do what took place just a little while ago. Tomorrow, General Kane, Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth will have a press conference at 8 a.m. at the Pentagon. And I want to just thank everybody, and in particular, God. I want to just say, we love you, God, and we love our great military. Protect them. God bless the Middle East. God bless Israel, and God bless America. Thank you very much. Thank you.
President Trump there at the White House, Vice President J.D. Vance, Secretary of State Marco Rubio also serving as his national security advisor, along with Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth right there with President Trump announcing to the nation, similar to what he said in his post on social media not long ago, that the U.S. is now directly involved with Iran, striking 3 nuclear locations, Fordo, Natanz, and Esfahan, 3 nuclear facilities that the U.S. had long been studying, as well as international observers around the world in tracking Iran's nuclear program and their desire perhaps one day to have a nuclear weapon. I want to bring in Mary Bruce. Let's go back to Mary at the White House. Mary, the president had warned Iran, come to the table. Let's negotiate some sort of a peace deal, that this current conflict must end. At last word, he said 2 weeks would be his deadline. We know that's turned out to be 2 days. We'll learn in the hours and days to come whether that was part of the strategy here. But this is a fairly risky move for this president, though tonight he says it's been a victory. He thanked U.S. forces who were involved, and he said if Iran does not end the wars and seek peace, tragedy for Iran will be even greater than what we've seen in the last 24 hours.
David, it is an extremely risky move, and no one knows really where this goes from here. Look, the president, we know, has long warned that Iran cannot get a nuclear weapon, but he also long was pushing for those negotiations. As you mentioned, it was just 2 days ago that the president announced, after yet another meeting in the Situation Room, that he was going to give himself this 2-week deadline within which to make this decision whether or not to strike Iran, in part because he thought there was, quote, a substantial chance of negotiations, that they would be able to get Iran back to the table. It is not clear still, even after hearing from the president just now, what changed his mind, what led him to believe there was no time left to waste, that the U.S. had to go ahead and get deeply involved in this conflict in a way that the president has also really promised the American people he would not. He campaigned on a promise to be a peacemaker and a unifier, to keep America out of these kinds of conflicts. And what's clear tonight is that the president is very much leaving open the door that there will be more of this. While he is hailing the strikes tonight as a huge success, he is also not ruling out additional military action, saying that there are many targets left, that they will act with precision, speed, and skill if needed. How all of this will ultimately end Iran's nuclear program is a huge question. And of course, David, Iran has promised a severe response if the U.S. were to be directly involved, as we now are.
And one quick follow-up to what you're reporting here, Mary. Obviously, you're watching ABC News live coverage at this hour. The president just addressing the nation, talking about the U.S. striking 3 Iranian nuclear sites, the president calling it a tremendous success, speaking briefly with our John Carl earlier this evening before addressing the nation about this. And Mary, you've covered President Trump for some time. You've covered him as a candidate, his promises not to engage in the Middle East and in any more foreign wars. At the same time, he has long promised that Iran would not get a nuclear weapon.
Yeah, and David, just again 2 days ago, the White House, while saying that they were giving themselves this 2-week timeline, again stressed that Iran was very close to getting a nuclear weapon, saying that Iran had everything it needed to achieve a nuclear weapon, and that once the supreme leader gave the go-ahead, that it could be just a few weeks before Iran had that full capability. Clearly, something changed in the president's calculus to make him go ahead and make this decision tonight. It is a remarkable turn for a president who has avoided getting dragged into these kind of conflicts, and it is one that his presidency, it will now define. That is for sure.
Our chief White House correspondent, Mary Bruce, with us live here tonight. Mary, thank you. I want to bring in John Carl, our chief Washington correspondent. John, I was struck that you were able to connect with the president even before he addressed the nation tonight. Again, he was confident with what he had witnessed, what he'd been briefed on following this operation, and made it clear to the American people that all of the U.S. military involved in this operation is back out of that airspace and on their way home.
I think the most significant thing is I called him, really, David, just in the aftermath of learning about these attacks, within an hour of his speech that we just saw, and he picked up the phone. That was a measure of how eager he was to tout what he said in those words he said to me, a tremendous success tonight. He didn't want to talk about the details of the operation, about the very difficult questions, David, of what are the next steps? What happens with Iran? What happens with Iran's efforts to retaliate? We heard some of that in the speech just now when he said the attacks will be far greater and much easier. if Iran does anything to the United States. But David, we are in a new phase here right now. I think it is without question the most consequential decision that we have ever seen Donald Trump make. And it's entirely unclear what direction it will go. Will it be consistent with his promise to end the forever wars? That's the argument that's being made tonight by the president's advisors. They're saying that what this has done is finally an American president has taken care of an Iranian threat that has bedeviled the United States for nearly a half a century. Finally, an American president has ended a threat that has killed a lot of Americans, as you heard the president mention, in the attacks on American troops, especially in Iraq. But the question is, did it end the threat, or did it create another new and more dangerous chapter in the U.S.-Iran conflict?
Yeah, no question, it is a new chapter, John Carl. Bottom line here, the willingness to get on the phone with you signaled that the president was very pleased with the outcome of this operation tonight.
Very pleased with the outcome and eager to tell people that he is very pleased with the outcome tonight.
All right, John Carl, stick with us here for our live coverage. I want to bring in Martha Raddatz, our Chief Global Affairs Correspondent. And Martha, you had been on the air with us on World News Tonight all week long with your reporting. A couple of questions for you. We know B-2 bombers were used. Do we have any clarity yet on whether or not those bunker buster bombs, those 30,000-pound bombs, which had been tested before but never actually used in war, whether or not they were used in this operation?
That I can assume that they used those bombs because that's what it would take. And if the president is correct and they destroyed that facility, Fordo, with half a dozen bombs, half a dozen of those massive ordnance penetrators, then that is likely what they used. The Moab that has been used in Afghanistan and caves and such wouldn't have done the job, according to officials that I have spoken to. As you know, David, and we've talked about all week, those ordnance are basically down here by lecking out, conking out. There was a concern about whether work. I'd say tonight there's also about how.
All right, Martha, we're going to come back to you. Obviously, we're in live coverage mode and the audio a little tricky there. I want to bring in retired Colonel Steve Ganyard, also tracking the military aspect of this. And Steve, you heard Martha there report that likely they did use these 30,000-pound bombs, though the president in front of the country tonight did not say otherwise whether or not they did, in fact, use them.
Yeah, David, there's some unconfirmed reports that up to 6 of these so-called bunker buster bombs were used on the site at Fordo. Remember, that's the one that's so deeply buried, 200 to 300 feet underneath a mountain in central Iran. So we'll see what the president admits to or what the Pentagon's able to brief us on. Also, potentially, there was a use of Tomahawk cruise missiles to hit some of the sites in Natanz and Isfahan. So this is all very straightforward, all focused on the nuclear enterprise. Really important to note that the buildup within the region is unprecedented. There haven't been 3 carriers, once the Ford comes in next week, there have not been 3 carriers in the region since 2003. So over 20 years, we haven't had this amount of U.S. military firepower in the region. So clearly what the president said tonight is, this is not a one-off. If these Iranians don't come to the table, we are prepared to continue this and continue to hit targets.
And in fact, the president, Steve, saying if peace doesn't come quickly, we will go after other targets with speed and with skill. You bring up Fordo, and that was the nuclear location where we believe those bunker buster bombs would be used. Steve, just to help explain to our audience how difficult that would be, how deep beneath the mountain there the nuclear facilities were actually located, and why Israel had for some time now been hoping that President Trump and the U.S. military would be part of this operation. Tonight they now are.
Yeah, David, these bunker buster bombs were originally developed for the North Korean threat. You remember we've talked about what goes on with the Kim regime and how they've buried their nuclear facilities well. So there are only 2 places in the world where this weapon is appropriate, North Korea and Iran. Because it's so deeply buried, you need a very heavy weapon. So it's a 30,000-pound weapon. Only 5,000 pounds of that is explosive. It's a hardened case that's designed to penetrate. It has a fuse that can actually count floors as it goes through down to these buried targets. So the only country in the world, or the only country in the world, at least in the free world, that has bombers is the United States. The Israelis only have fighters, and they don't have anything that can carry a weapon of this size and weight. So it really was up to the U.S. with this very specific weapon that's only carried on the B-2 bomber to take down these hardened, deep targets within Fordo.
And obviously, the reason why we think they were used tonight was because we have had it confirmed that the B-2 bombers obviously made that trip over the skies of Iran. And Steve Martha had reported earlier in the week that these bunker busters have been tested but never used in war. So this would be a first tonight.
It would. They've been extensively tested, but no weapon's ever perfect. So we'll see if all of the weapons that are dropped actually went off. David, is really a well-played deception plan by the White House and by the Pentagon. They've been putting out that, oh, we see B-2 bombers taking off from Missouri and they're heading towards Guam. Meanwhile, it seems that the B-2 bombers may have come the other way while nobody was looking and conducted these strikes. So after the Iranians were done with the last discussion with the Europeans, and they said, we're not really interested in further discussions, the president obviously made a decision that they aren't going to be serious, and until we go in and take out these sites, that the threat will remain and the Israelis need our help.
Steve, let's talk about the Iranian airspace that the U.S. military entered tonight, because the president in recent days said, we control the Iranian airspace now. He said in so many words. The word we was what got so much attention. But in these recent days of the Israeli strikes on Iran, taking out military assets, but also their air defenses, that essentially Israel did control the airspace over Iran. This was a much different situation tonight, that the U.S. Was able to fly into the skies over Iran, and the U.S., the Pentagon, the White House surely knew that this was perhaps a window of opportunity, unlike what has been seen in years prior.
Yeah, David, if people may say, well, why do we need a stealth bomber if there's no air defenses? So the B-2 is very capable. You would fly it into, say, a China scenario where they would be looking for you on radar. It wasn't really required because the Israeli Air Force owns the skies over Iran. This part is not that surprising. You remember back in October of last year, David, when the Israelis struck Iran, we knew that they took out almost all of their air defenses. So we know that for months, Iran has been essentially blind and defenseless to any attacks from the air. And we've seen this over the past 8 or 9 days, where the Israeli Air Force has operated with impunity. What's really shocking and is extraordinary is the human intelligence that the Mossad has been able to develop, finding all those scientists, finding all those senior leaders, taking them out within the first few minutes of this war.
Steve Ganyard with us here tonight for our coverage. Steve, stick with us here. We'll come back to you, I'm sure. I want to bring in Matt Gutman also following our coverage tonight. And Matt, as you know, Benjamin Netanyahu in contact with President Trump, Israel tonight, saying that they were given a heads up. We also know that the Prime Minister has addressed the Israeli people just a short time ago. They had been hoping, Netanyahu had been hoping, that President Trump would give the go-ahead for the U.S. To have direct involvement in Iran, and that's what's played out here tonight.
That's exactly what played out here, and this is something that Prime Minister Netanyahu has been hoping for, not just in the past 10 days since this campaign began, but for many, many years. He has been hoping, praying for a U.S. president to come to its aid, because Israel could do a lot of the work. They have one of the most capable fleets of air forces in the Middle East, possibly the world. But as Steve mentioned, they do not have bombers. They have fighter bombers. They can carry 2,000-pound bombs, but nothing greater than that. So they needed whatever bunker buster capability the United States has. They also needed refueling planes, right? They have a couple, but not the amount that can have essentially to transfer their entire air force from the theater around Israel directly over Iran, which is 2,000 kilometers away, about 1,500 miles or so, a little bit less. A source telling me also that the U.S. and Israel had war gamed this. They had practiced this in the past year. That happened initially during the Biden administration. So this is not something that just came out of the blue, a plan that was recently devised. They have actively been working on this in a novel way over the past year. That source also telling me that they are confident that the damage done in Fordo specifically, but also the other sites, is, quote, irreversible. Now they anticipate that there will be some sort of Iranian reaction. There has to be some sort of retaliation, but it is the estimation among many in the Israeli defense and military establishment right now that is going to be measured and calculated, because the Iranian regime, David, wants to stay in power. Right now, they are fighting for their survival. One miscalculation with President Trump, with, as Steve noted, 3 aircraft carrier groups in the region, could be devastating for them. So The understanding is that they're going to do what they need to do, have some sort of response, and try to live to fight another day, David.
Matt Gupman with us here. Matt, thank you. I want to bring in our chief foreign correspondent, Ian Pannell, with us here. Matt brings up the point of any potential retaliation from Iran. The sun now coming up there behind you, Ian. First of all, the state of play in the region at this hour after the U.S. got involved directly in the skies over Iran. What have you seen? What have you heard? And what should viewers here in the U.S. be prepared for potentially as far as the warnings of retaliation from the supreme leader and from Iran?
Yeah, not just from Iran, but of course from its proxies. We've already heard from the Houthi rebels inside Yemen that they will respond. They had warned very clearly. Remember, there was an agreement between the Houthi rebels who are backed by Iran and the United States government. It was a unilateral deal that didn't include the Israelis to stop targeting U.S. ships in the region. It is a key waterway. 20% of all oil supplies in the world go through that region, through the Straits of Hormuz, and that is an obvious weapon at the disposal of Iran to potentially respond. But there are a number of targets across the region. You have thousands of U.S. soldiers stationed in Iraq. You have pro-Iranian militias there, the Popular Mobilization Units. You have U.S. soldiers also stationed inside Syria. You have other U.S. bases like Bahrain in the Gulf. So there are potential military targets. There are potential civilian targets. We had been reporting with you that the U.S. military had been evacuating U.S. diplomats and their families, certainly from here in Israel. We know that even before any of this began, there was a downgrading of presence across U.S. Diplomatic missions around the region, that many people had left, and they are on high alert. The U.S. consulate is just down the road here, and I can tell you that security down there has been stepped up for fear that if the United States joined this war, which it now has done, with a warning from the president, not that this was just an isolated act, but that if Tehran does not capitulate, does not come to the table, then there could be further military action. Then those assets, the Iran and its proxies, could potentially attack the U.S. Now, undoubtedly, the regime is weakened. We were speaking to a senior IDF official who told us that they feel that they have neutralized 50% of all Iran's capacity to fire missiles. But the Israeli Home Front Command, just in the last few minutes, issuing a warning to all Israelis to stay close to their shelters. Do not go to work, do not go to school, prepare for the worst.
And they had slowly begun to allow the economy to come back, communities to come back across Israel. And again, as you mentioned moments ago, Israel informing the people of that country that they're essentially in this sort of emergency moment, waiting to see what the reaction could be from Iran. But Ian, you bring up an excellent point there. In addition to the thousands of American troops, obviously throughout the region, that everyone back here at home wants to remain very safe in these tense moments, waiting to see if there'll be any reaction from Iran or its proxies. You bring up Iran's air defenses. You bring up proxies, including Hezbollah, significantly weakened. You talk about 50%. We've seen what Israel has done in recent days. We saw what Israel did in response to the October 7th attacks to Hezbollah, of course, north of the border in Israel. Significantly weakened Iran's positioning. And the question is, what do they have left and what would they risk knowing those three carriers, those U.S. carriers, are in the region? And President Trump's warning tonight that if peace doesn't come quickly, we will act, and we will act quickly.
Yeah, I think the calculation is different under President Trump than it was under President Biden. But even under President Biden, they deployed more military resources to the region to support Israel, first of all in its war with Hamas and then with Hezbollah. It's been actively involved. The U.S. THAAD air defense system has been actively deployed out at sea here, and also air defenses on land to try and intercept these ballistic missiles. Now, 10 to 15% have managed to get through. But I can tell you it's now been many many hours since anything happened here, and I think people are waiting to see. But all of those proxies have been severely degraded. I mean, since October the 7th, 2023, the entire shape of the Middle East, in particular Israel's enemies, and by extension America's enemies, have been weakened. You've got Hamas, you've got a change of regime in Syria, you've got Hezbollah and the Houthi rebels in Yemen, and we haven't even talked about the Iranian Ba'ath militias in Iraq. They will be a major concern for the US administration and for the Israelis, because they do have the capacity, as we've seen before, to respond to US bases in the region. When General Soleimani was assassinated by the US military, we were in Iraq at the time, and we saw that rockets were fired directly from Iran towards those US bases. So all of that is vulnerable, and the whole idea that the regime in Iran is just going to pack up its bags and say, fine, that's the end of things, I suspect is unlikely at this point. They will have to be seen to respond, but the threat from President Trump is serious. It will be heard loud and clear across the region.
And the other question here tonight, the leadership of Iran and the future of the supreme leader.
Yeah, I mean, undoubtedly they are weakened. Now, it's an authoritarian regime, and as we've seen elsewhere, it lives or dies on its ability to project strength domestically, and that has been weakened. It doesn't control its own skies. Again, a senior Israeli official talking to us just 24 hours ago.
Ian Panel live from Tel Aviv. Ian, stay where you are. We're going to continue our ABC News live coverage. The U.S. directly involved now in Iran. Images from the Situation Room in a moment here of the president and the vice president from their meeting a short time ago. I'll be right back.
All across America.
Good morning. Hello.
Wherever we are,
Welcome home.
it feels like home.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you.
Man, it's good to be home.
GMA, it's an invitation to come together
Good morning.
and brighten your morning.
It's the music event of summer, CMA Fest.
Are you guys ready to party tonight?
With can't-miss performances by Blake Shelton, Megan Maroney, Ella Langley, Keith Urban, Kelsey Ballerini, and more. Plus, one-of-a-kind collaborations featuring Brooks and Dunn and Lainey Wilson, Shabuzi and Jelly Roll, and Bailey Zimmerman and Big X The Plug. Hosted by Ashley McBride and Cody Johnson.
What's going on, CMA?
CMA Fest, presented by SoFi. Thursday on ABC and stream next day on Hulu.
The best way to know a thing is to take it apart, put it back together.
Might be a hero in there after all.
Ironheart, streaming June 24th, only on Disney+.
It's time to party!
Monday, July 7th.
And now we're in the jungle.
Ready to find some love.
Let's dance, Paradise.
Paradise is back.
Good things are coming.
New beach,
Viva la Costa Rica!
new challenges. And here come the Goldens.
Oh, look at, I got my inner knees done. They're reformed.
Bachelor in Paradise premieres July 7th on ABC and stream on Hulu.
Millionaire is back.
Can we keep the money ourselves?
And this season, it's personal.
Do we love Matt Damon or what?
I'm coming on Jeopardy with someone you hate.
An all-new season of Who Wants to Be a Millionaire starts July 23rd on ABC and stream on Hulu.
The entire NBA season comes down to one single game.
There's nothing like Game 7 in the NBA Finals. Dreamed of being in this situation my whole life.
One game for everything you ever dreamed of. You win it, you get everything. If you lose it, you get nothing.
Game 7 only fitting with the way these two teams have gone at it.
The NBA Finals, Pacers Thunder, Game 7 on ABC.
We're back, baby.
Yes.
Grandma, he smells really good.
Name something your mate's booty has in common with the basketball.
It bounces.
There's one true thing about restaurants. You are never alone.
It is now 10:30 here in the East, 10:30 Eastern on a Saturday night. The president addressing the nation about 30 minutes ago, talking to the American people about the U.S. now directly involved in Iran. The U.S. military striking 3 nuclear sites inside Iran this evening, Fordo, Natanz, and Esfahan. As you know, Fordo is the site that we had been reporting on at length in recent days, given the fact that that nuclear facility is deep beneath the mountain there. The question was whether or not B-2 bombers would be used and whether or not those B-2 bombers would drop those 30,000-pound bunker buster bombs. We had been reporting on that all week long. Tonight, we have confirmed that the B-2 bombers were in fact used. The president did not make clear in his address to the nation whether or not the 30,000-pound bombs had been dropped, but it's believed that they were in fact used. He said to the American people, the president did, that the sites have been completely, totally obliterated. He spoke of Israel as well this evening, saying we worked as a team in this, and he said the tragedy for Iran will be far greater than what we've witnessed in recent days if they do not bring peace and bring peace now, saying that we will go after other targets with speed and with skill. And you can see the president there for those of you who are joining us at the top of the hour, the vice president there to his side, Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, also National Security Advisor at this point, holding 2 roles, and Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth there with him as well. The images from the Situation Room that they have released here tonight show them huddled in the Situation Room. This is at least the 4th time this week that we have learned that the team had been gathered in the Situation Room. Obviously, you see the president there, the vice president moments ago there at his side. You can see Susie Wiles there, Chief of Staff, and others gathered in the Situation Room here this evening as the mission was playing out. The president, a short time thereafter, posting online and on social media that this had been a success. In fact, telling the nation what had played out, applauding the U.S. troops and signaling to the American people that they were no longer in Iranian airspace, that they were now on their way home. He told the American people in that social media post, "We have completed our very successful attack on 3 nuclear sites in Iran, including Fordo, Natanz, and Esfahan. All planes now outside of Iran airspace. A full payload of bombs was dropped on the primary site, Fordo." And again, what we'll be reporting out in the hours to come is whether or not those were the 30,000-pound bombs that the U.S. military has tested significantly but never actually used in war. All planes, the president said, now safely on their way home. And he went on to say, congratulations to our great American warriors. There's not another military in the world, he said, that could have done this. Again, this is what he urged live before the American people as well. He said now is the time for peace when it comes to Iran. And again, the warning that came from the president just a short time ago in addressing the American people and the world, knowing that Iran watching as well. He said to the Iranian leadership, if peace does not come quickly, we will go after other targets with speed and skill. I want to bring back in our chief White House correspondent, Mary Bruce. Mary, have you heard anything from the White House yet? And of course, you heard me talk to Ian about the future of the Supreme Leader. President Trump was asked about the Supreme Leader in recent days. He said, I know where he is. We have intelligence on him. Insinuated in many ways that it would be a somewhat easy target, but said it was not a target he intended to go after, at least not now.
Yeah, the president in that post essentially threatening the Supreme Leader, saying he's not going to go after him yet, not going to kill him yet, but making it clear that is something that seems to be on the table. Iran, of course, we know has threatened a severe response if the U.S. were to get more involved, as they now have, of course. And interesting that the president tonight, in his very brief remarks, just about four minutes, I believe, made it very clear that he was working in close coordination with the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. I'm told that the U.S. gave Israel a heads up before these strikes tonight. We know that the president also spoke with him after the strikes. And of course, seeing those images of the president working closely with his team, they have met every single day this week, 4 meetings in the Situation Room, as you mentioned, here at the White House. Actually, one of the first indications of what was going on here tonight, we saw Marco Rubio, some of the other officials who were in the Situation Room out here on the driveway, making what appeared to be some urgent phone calls. And the president saying that we are going to be hearing directly from Secretary Hegseth Seth and other military leaders tomorrow morning in a rare Sunday morning press conference. The question is what comes next. And as you noted, of course, the president isn't ruling out future attacks. The president making clear that there are many targets left, that he will not hesitate to act with precision, speed, and skill. It is not clear where this ends. And of course, what the ultimate impact is of these strikes on Iran's nuclear program. It's one of the reasons that the president for so long has urged and pushed for talks, even in recent days, hopeful that the U.S. could somehow get Iran back to the negotiating table, because without a deal, it's not clear. You may, certainly it would be a huge setback to Iran's nuclear ambitions, but, how long will this last? How big will that setback be? These are all questions and things that we need to unpack, David.
Yeah, right now we're in a window of uncertainty for sure. And of course, Iran had said earlier this week, Mary, that there would be retaliation if the U.S. Did directly get involved, which has played out here tonight. I wanted to ask you, I know that there has been reaction over on Capitol Hill, lawmakers applauding the president, Republican lawmakers, though there has been some division within the Republican Party in the buildup to this moment. And as you know, you covered the president out on the campaign trail as well, leading up to the election, that he campaigned often on staying out of costly foreign conflicts, away from American interventionism, promising to stay out of the Middle East. He also at the same time promised that Iran would never have a nuclear weapon. He's now involved tonight with Iran. And again, the question now, the uncertainty now is whether and if Iran will respond in any sort of significant way.
Yeah, in many ways, David, this is exactly what President Trump was hoping to avoid. He promised on the campaign trail no more wars, that he was not going to drag America into another lengthy conflict in the Middle East. In fact, David, just last month, I was with the president in the Middle East at the largest U.S. military air base in Qatar. The president again there saying that his priority was to end conflicts and not start them. But in that same speech, speaking to thousands of American troops, he also said, if America is threatened, that he will respond with overwhelming and devastating strength and force. So yes, this is something that the president promised he would not do. But as you noted, he also long promised that Iran would not be allowed to get a nuclear weapon. And he has made clear in recent days that he feels that they were very close to having one. But we also know that as he made this decision about how he was going to respond, was he going to take the action that he has taken tonight, he was well aware of the deep divisions within his own party, which we really have seen play out very publicly this week. I'm thinking of that sparring between Senator Ted Cruz and Tucker Carlson that so crystallized the division. So many of the president's supporters urging him to follow through on those promises not to get involved in further conflict. Others in the party, of course, urging him to not hold out for negotiations, but to go ahead and strike.
Mary Bruce at the White House. Mary, our thanks to you. I want to bring in our chief Washington correspondent, Jonathan Karl. John, we spoke last hour. I know that you talked with President Trump even before he addressed the nation tonight. We were both somewhat struck by the fact that we were able to get him on the phone, which signaled that he was very pleased with what he saw play out tonight, though the president obviously very clear, John, that this window now, this new uncertainty that exists, this new chapter that we're in, the potential for any sort of response from Iran or its proxies across the region. And you can see that actually in President Trump's social media post just a short time ago, warning once again against any kind of retaliation.
Yeah, echoing what he said in his speech to the nation, saying any retaliation by Iran against the United States will be met with a force far greater than what was witnessed tonight. Very similar to what he told the nation, echoing, pointing to the fact that this is a moment of tremendous uncertainty. Will what the United States did tonight, the most consequential decision Donald Trump has ever made, will it lead to a series of countermeasures by the Iranian regime and its proxies and its allies in the region, attacks on the United States, or will it lead to regime change in Iran? Will it lead ultimately to the collapse of the revolutionary government that has led Iran as an adversary, a fierce adversary of the United States for some 47 years, 46 years. So, David, what he's signaling is if it happens, if the first scenario happens and Iran strikes out at the United States in retaliation, something that Iran has vowed to do, that Donald Trump is prepared to escalate this. So where are we in terms of his promises of ending forever wars? Under one scenario, this is a beginning, not an end, to our conflict with Iran.
It certainly has reshaped the Middle East and what it looks like, in the weeks and months from now. Obviously, we cannot say at this point, though, a significant move tonight on the part of the U.S. military at the instruction of the president to strike 3 major nuclear facilities inside Iran. And again, of course, Fordo is the one many of our viewers are familiar with, the most reporting on it because it's deep underground. John, stick with us. Again, John, speaking to President Trump before he addressed the nation, the president expressing to John that he was very pleased with what he saw played out, said it was tremendous success, and then addressing the nation 10 p.m. Eastern, speaking of these 3 facilities. I do want to bring in Martha Raddatz back with us this half hour. And Martha, the question going into tonight and this operation, he said there was a 2-week timeline. It turned out to be 2 days. Of course, we'll report this out, whether or not that was part of the strategy here. The question was, B-2 bombers, would they be used? We know they were. We know they flew all the way or halfway around the world to get to the Iranian airspace. And we presume that they did use those 30,000-pound bombs. They would have to reach deep beneath that mountain there in Iran.
That's exactly right, David. They would almost have to have used those massive ordnance penetrators that can go so deeply into that mountainside. That's what Israel was waiting for. That's what Israel wanted to go over Fordo, because it really, truly is the only bomb that could penetrate that deeply. I think one of the things that will have to be checked clearly is that the president clearly said this was a tremendous success. They destroyed it. Whether they can get people on the ground to see if it is completely destroyed, because an underground facility, you can't really tell, although they certainly have ways to find out as much as possible. But I think one thing tonight, David, that we really do have to say, it is clear the U.S. is now at war. It is exactly what we've been talking about all evening, that this is what the president wanted to avoid, but we are now there. And as we brace for possible retaliation, certainly Iran has suffered great loss, but they are perfectly capable of going after U.S. troops, and there are 40,000 of them in the region, David.
It's a very important point, Martha. Martha, thank you. And again, Martha, underscoring the fact that we are, as a nation, the U.S. now at war with Iran tonight. The president warning again on social media moments ago what he said at the top of the hour in his address to the American people, warning against retaliation from Iran, saying there would be even greater force, greater speed from the U.S. if Iran or its proxies retaliate in any sort of way. I want to get right back to our chief foreign correspondent, Ian Pannell, who has been live on the ground in Tel Aviv for us many nights in a row now here. And Ian, for folks who are watching back here in the U.S., what particular threat do the American forces that Martha just spoke of, the tens of thousands who are spread throughout that region, what kind of threat do they face? You and I have been talking about how the air defenses in Iran have been significantly wiped out, perhaps 50% or more by the action taken by Israel in recent days. But that doesn't mean that there aren't ways for Iran and its proxies to retaliate.
Yeah, and that has been, in many senses, the speciality of Iran. It has contracted out its offensive operations. It's known as the world's #1 sponsor of terrorism. That's a phrase that we've heard repeatedly. The Houthi rebels inside Yemen, Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas also in Gaza, but also other groups. It has been guilty of malign activities, and you have a heavy U.S. military presence throughout the region, in Iraq, in Syria, in Bahrain and elsewhere. You have heavy diplomatic presence. We've seen diplomats being evacuated from here along with their families, and diplomatic presence elsewhere in the region reduced. We were reporting on World News just 24 hours or so ago about people American citizens trying to leave Iran, some reportedly experiencing difficulties doing that. So the U.S. will be highly concerned about the potential for retaliatory strikes. Now, as you say, what is Iran's capacity? Israeli officials telling me that they believe that they have neutralized, that was their phrase, neutralized 50% of Iran's ability to fire missiles. Not necessarily the missiles themselves, but the launch systems. They say there's a bottleneck. In other words, it has plenty of missiles, its capacity to launch them. But when Israel said that it controlled the skies, what that looks like on the the ground is there are Israeli drones constantly over Tehran, something that would have been unthinkable just a couple of weeks ago, especially to the Ayatollah, and Iran's capacity to gather intelligence, to respond, to act without interception has been severely diminished. Its key allies, Russia and China, are standing to one side. They have no appetite to get involved in this. I mean, conversely, Russia has benefited because the price of its own energy supplies has skyrocketed. But there are concerns specifically about the oil supplies that come out of Iran. 20% of the world's oil supplies go through the Straits of Hormuz. We saw previously that the Houthi rebels inside Yemen were capable of striking U.S. carriers as well as other international carriers. That is a group specifically that I think we should be watching. That will have an impact on oil prices, and the U.S. doesn't depend on oil from that region in the same way that the Europeans and the Chinese do, for sure, but it will have a potential knock-on effect. So there are a number of ways that Iran could retaliate, but the president was very clear, we shouldn't lose track of that if Iran didn't acquiesce, that if it didn't sign up to some kind of peace process, there would be further action.
Ian, you and I both know that the president certainly has not talked about a regime change in any sort of way, and certainly didn't tonight in addressing the American people. Instead, obviously talking about the desire to, and he said they were completely, totally obliterated when he talked about Fordo, Natanz, and Esfahan, these 3 nuclear sites in Iran. But you can't help but to think about the future of the current leadership of Iran, and in particular the supreme leader, who the president has talked about in recent days. Obviously, too early to know, but it would seem the future for that supreme leader is somewhat in question.
Exactly. And we've heard again repeatedly from the Israelis. I mean, certainly when there was that very heavy strike here, when that hospital was hit, we had the Israeli defense minister directly blaming and threatening the Iranian supreme leader, suggesting that he would be a valid target. Prime Minister Netanyahu and the Israeli president, who I spoke to, also said that he was a key part of the problem. But again, an Israeli military official talking to me on background was adamant that that wasn't part of the agenda. However, when you weaken an authoritarian regime like that, when you force someone like Ayatollah Ali Khamenei underground, he's not been seen in public apart from once or twice, that raises questions in people's minds. The regime lives and dies on its ability to project strength and actual physical coercive force on the ground, and that has been diminished. It has been suggested to us that the Israelis, as well as going after military targets, could go after state security targets. If those forces are no longer powerful, then it may well lead to further action. Certainly, Iranian, Persian friends that I know believe that people will respond on the ground. It's early days, we're not seeing it yet, but the capacity for self-generated change has now just gone up dramatically.
Okay, so Ian, panel, you bring up the very important point of the potential ways in which Iran could react across the region there. Ian, panel, tremendous reporting all week long, and we appreciate your coverage with us here on a Saturday night. Stick with us. I want to bring in Pierre Thomas, our Chief Justice Correspondent, back stateside, covering the domestic threat. Of course, people watching us here on a Saturday night, Pierre, want to know what is Iran's capability, not only to react overseas throughout the region with thousands of U.S. military stations across the region, but also here in the U.S. We know that there are lone wolves, there are actors that certainly Iran would want to react in some sort of way to the U.S. action we've witnessed tonight. What are U.S. authorities here in the homeland prepared for potentially, and what have they said?
Well, David, one of the things they're most concerned about in the immediate future would be the potential for cyber attacks. Iran and its proxies have shown some capabilities to project from thousands of miles away. That's an immediate threat. DHS actually put out a notice just a couple of weeks ago after Israel started to attack Iran, warning the U.S. infrastructure, that's the electrical grid, energy sector, financial sector, to double check their computer systems to make sure that they have the proper defense mechanisms. So that's a concern. There's obviously always been concern about the ability of Iran, to project inside the United States. Do they have operatives here? The U.S. government has made a number of cases involving Iranian operatives in the United States attempting to impact dissidents here, that sort of thing. Also, there would be concern about just a general reaction to the notion of the U.S. government, the U.S. military, taking a military strike to the homeland of Iran. So officials here will be looking at that kind of thing as well, David.
Pierre Thomas with us on the potential threat here at home as well. And of course, you say, Pierre, that what authorities within the administration are most concerned about at this point, and at this point, we point out it's very early in this sort of new chapter we're in, potential window of time here where there could be any kind of reaction, retaliation from Iran or its proxies. Most concerned about a potential cyber attack, as Pierre said, though there could be other operatives that the U.S. Is keeping its eye on as well. I want to bring in Rachel Scott, our senior political correspondent, and Rachel obviously covers the White House, Capitol Hill. She covered President Trump as a candidate. And Rachel, you heard Mary and I talking about this notion earlier that this is a president, obviously, who has campaigned, not just in this campaign when he was elected back to the White House, but in the campaign leading to his election in 2016 on campaigning against American interventionism, against American, any kind of a role for the U.S. and U.S. military in the Middle East, any kind of increased role in these costly, dangerous conflicts. His supporters will say that's not in conflict with what he has also said about nuclear war and that Iran should never get its hands on a nuclear weapon. And that's the case he's trying to make in these last couple of days leading up to this action that he authorized tonight.
Yeah, his supporters definitely, David, will say both things can be true here, that the president can be adamant that Iran can never have a nuclear weapon, but also at the same time can still want to be a unifier, a peacemaker. You heard those calls for peace again today coming from the president as he addressed the nation again tonight. But there is no doubt this has created a divide within the Republican Party, even leading up to this. As we were reporting that the president was warming up to the idea of U.S. involvement, of possibly striking Iran, we heard from a number of Republicans who did not want the president to move forward with this, who expressed concern and frustration about the U.S. being involved, primarily because of that campaign promise that the president made, that he was going to be a unifier, that he was going to be a peacemaker, that he was going to withdraw the United States from these ongoing foreign conflicts. This, of course, directly goes against that. It's at odds with that. At the same time, David, I will tell you that speaking to my sources and Republican members on Capitol Hill, the president received numerous calls from Republican lawmakers, even from Senator Lindsey Graham, who was urging the president to get directly involved. He wanted to see the United States join Israel's effort in this. And obviously, the president also, I'm told, getting a lot of pressure directly from Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu as well. We've also been working the phones, David. We are learning tonight that Speaker Mike Johnson and also Senate Majority Leader John Thune were, in fact, notified that the U.S. was going to be carrying out these strikes. We're also told that Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries was also notified as well, but given very little details. We are also told, David, from multiple sources that the Gang of Eight, this is the top leaders on Capitol Hill in both the Senate and the House, that they were not given a full briefing as the United States made this decision, the Trump administration making this decision to move forward with these strikes, David.
Rachel Scott covering this as well with us here tonight. Rachel, always great to have you with you and your context as well. I do want to mention the statement that's been released by the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu of Israel, obviously. Video statement. He congratulated President Trump for his, quote, bold decision to target Iran's nuclear facilities. The United States, Netanyahu said, has done what no other country on earth could do. History will record that President Trump acted to deny the world's most dangerous regime, the world's most dangerous weapons. And as you heard Rachel say, you heard other correspondents here along the way point out that this was exactly what Benjamin Netanyahu had been hoping for, that the U.S. Would become directly involved with Iran, which is what's played out tonight. President Trump addressing the nation about 53 minutes ago now to let the nation know that the U.S. military has struck 3 nuclear sites deep inside Iran, Fordo, Natanz, and Esfahan. Obviously, Fordo is the site that in particular, deep beneath the ground, beneath that mountain, B-2 bombers were used. We believe those 30,000-pound bombs were also used to target these sites. The president saying they are completely, totally obliterated, though we'll have to see in the hours and days to come what kind of of assessment from international observers can be made about the damage done tonight, though clearly there was significant damage done, and the White House believes beyond repair in many cases. I want to bring in retired Colonel Steve Ganyard again with us. Steve, you and I have been talking about U.S. military capability, and regardless of where people stand on this politically, this was a significant use of force tonight, and something that has long been studied by not only this administration but administrations before it. President Trump, the president who has decided to move forward with this in a key moment when air defenses were significantly weakened in the skies over Iran, Israel essentially controlling those skies as U.S. B-2 bombers flew in tonight.
Yeah, David, John Carl is reporting that Tomahawk missiles were also used in the strikes tonight. Now, Tomahawk missiles, as you remember, are cruise missiles, and they hug the earth, so they fly very low, and they aren't intended to do this deep penetration that we needed the B-2s for. So the point here is that it really was just the B-2 crews that were in danger tonight. We didn't put any other U.S. forces over Iran, so there was very little risk other than to those B-2 crews. Given how sophisticated the B-2 is, there's very little likelihood that the Iranians would be able to do anything about it. So the question will be, how far will the president be willing to go, depending on the Iranian reaction, in terms of deploying military force that may involve putting U.S. forces at greater risk than we saw tonight.
And of course, Steve, you heard the president there warn that if peace doesn't come quickly from Iran now, that we will go after additional targets with speed and with skill. We have that animation that shows what these bunker buster bombs can do. If we can show that, because a U.S. official now confirms that B-2 bombers dropped a number of massive ordnance penetrator bombs. As you know, that's the long term for these bunker buster bombs, 30,000-pound bombs. Now confirming to ABC News that they were used in this mission tonight over Iran. The official also confirming that a number of Tomahawk cruise missiles were fired at targets inside Iran from a U.S. Navy submarine. You heard President Trump addressing the nation 10 p.m. Eastern here tonight. Brief words and then getting on social media again shortly thereafter to warn Iran and its proxies against any sort of retaliation. But at first word tonight, which came shortly before 8 o'clock p.m. Eastern time, the president saying, we have completed our very successful attack on 3 nuclear sites in Iran, including Fordo, Natanz, and Esfahan. All planes are now outside Iranian airspace. A full payload of bombs, he said, was dropped on that primary site of Fordo. That is the key site that is deep beneath sort of a range of mountains there. And we had reported for some time that it would probably take those bunker busters to actually do significant damage to that nuclear facility. And again, ABC News now confirming that those B-2 bombers did drop those 30,000-pound bombs. Our coverage will continue first thing in the morning for many of you. Your local news is next. Good night.
This has been a special report from ABC News.